I just don't think that sanctions alone are going to alter Vladimir Putin's behavior. He's shown that he is quite willing to continue his course of action despite whatever Western sanctions there are. And partly it's because there's, a lot of other nations are not imposing sanctions. They are trading with Russia anyway. So, I think that the leverage that Trump could have is to increase military support for Ukraine.
Russia has yet to give a substantive response to President Donald Trump's warning that it must end its more than 3-year war in Ukraine. With us to talk through it all is Mark Katz, Professor Emeritus at George Mason University in Virginia, who's long specialised in Russia's foreign policy and security. Professor Katz, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
This is a sharp reduction in that deadline from 50 days to 10 days for Vladimir Putin to sign up to a ceasefire. So it's about a week away now. Is this any different to that earlier ultimatum, or could it be an empty threat?
Well, I think that what Trump understands is that Putin was not going to take up the opportunity that President Trump provided him. And so, by having a deadline of 50 days, that basically gives him a free pass to keep fighting for longer. And so I think that the idea of, let's cut to the chase and let's move this down to 10 days. And then, since we're probably going to have to get to sanctions anyway, may as well do it sooner rather than later.
Is there a sense this is trying to battle Putin running down the clock? Perhaps Trump has cottoned on to that idea that Putin just kicks it into the long grass further away.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that I think that President Trump has undergone a learning curve these past few months. I think he really came into office thinking that he had a great relationship with Putin, and surely Putin would want to make a deal with Trump, if not with Biden, obviously. And so, that basically by, saying that Putin can keep the territory he occupies and indicating that Ukraine wouldn't join NATO, what more would Putin want? That should be good enough. And yet obviously for Putin it wasn't. And I think that that's the thing. What Putin seems to want is much more expansive concessions, which would not just weaken Ukraine, but which would weaken the NATO alliance. And Trump simply wasn't willing to go this far.
Is there a real sense that we haven't had a strong response from Russia, or much of a response at all? Can you see a path where Vladimir Putin could agree to Trump's demands, hit that deadline, and still claim some sort of victory, even without those goals that he set out at the beginning of his special operation?
Well, he could. I mean, in my mind, that if basically he took up Trump's offer, that would be, getting far more than others would have conceded to him. So, I think he could. And I think that he's strong enough internally that if he says that the end of the war on the current basis is a great victory for Russia, well, I don't think that anyone's going to disagree with him. And I think that Russian public opinion, that they would be happy to see the war come to an end. They don't need to prosecute it further. If they get to keep the territory that Russia already has, that's fine. Public opinion polls have indicated that the Russian public wants the war to end, but does not want to make any territorial concessions. And so I think that Trump has offered Putin a pretty decent off-ramp if Putin wants to take it, but it doesn't appear that he wants to take it.
What do you think is the barrier to accepting that off-ramp?
Well, I think that Putin feels that he has the advantage. In other words, that Russian forces are gaining ground, even if it's very slowly, that he's prepared to make sacrifices that Western governments are not, that the Ukrainian government might not be able to make. Therefore, he's going to win. And I think that, he's probably in a bubble, because I don't think that he's, that people around him are telling him exactly what he wants to hear. I think it's dangerous to do anything otherwise. So I just think that he thinks he has the advantage, and so why not press it? Because I think for him, it's not just a matter of taking territory from Ukraine. It's changing the international order in Europe, and he wants to do that, and he thinks he can. So yeah, he's certainly not going to agree to a ceasefire in anticipation of the implementation by the Trump administration of sanctions or whatever it is that it undertakes. And we've seen with Trump, he threatens sanctions and then he pulls back. So I think that Putin basically wants to see, well, what do you got here? And he'll wait for that.
On board Air Force One, President Trump said, I'm not too worried about damaging the economy with sanctions and tariffs as he's threatening to place on Russia and anyone who trades with them. Is there any leverage that Mr. Trump has beyond that?
Well, personally, I just don't think that sanctions alone are going to alter Vladimir Putin's behavior. He's shown that he is quite willing to continue his course of action despite whatever Western sanctions there are. And partly it's because there's, a lot of other nations are not imposing sanctions. They are trading with Russia anyway. So, I think that the leverage that Trump could have is to increase military support for Ukraine. In other words, the one thing he came into office complaining that the Biden administration had done too much, the Europeans weren't doing enough, but at the end of the day, this is what's going to be needed, it seems to me.
I've been looking at op-eds in Russian newspapers on Wednesday. They echo what you're saying about the sanctions and tariffs. They say they won't hurt Russia, but just set up a fight with China, who is the big buyer of Russian oil. How does China see the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think that the Chinese foreign minister, when he met with the EU leader, he stated pretty bluntly that China cannot afford to see Russia lose this war, and because if it does, then he anticipates that the United States will focus its attention even more on China. And so I think that to them that's the bottom line. That's and I think that basically one of the things that Trump will need to do is to somehow change that perception on China's part. Obviously China is becoming more and more powerful. It's, obviously economically much stronger than Russia, but it's Russia that's actually behaving, forcefully. The Chinese have obviously not. They have behaved, forcefully. So they haven't actually engaged in combat with their neighbors recently, the way that Russia is clearly doing. And so I think that there's a strong belief in Washington that somehow China is the greater threat. Certainly, I think Trump came into office thinking that, wouldn't it be great to somehow wrap up this little conflict with Russia and then, maybe we can even get the Russians to join us against China. Well, that's just not going to happen, it seems to me. But that there's going to have to be, a discussion with China. Yeah, you don't want to see Russia lose, but can you really afford to see Russia win? And I've argued that basically, the Chinese are actually in the best position to bring about this an end to this war if they really want. And that is, if they really want to increase their influence in Europe, what they have to do is to do better for Europe what America has done. That is, protect Europe from Russia. China seems to have this idea that you can have close relations with Russia and with Europe as well, but it really can't. And that's I think what the Chinese, that their own sort of intellectual block, if you will. And I think that basically the more threatening Russia is to Europe, that this actually harms Chinese interests. China has a big trade relationship. The stronger Russia is, that this is not going to benefit China at all. And can they rein in Russia? maybe they can't. I don't know. But they, I think that what has to be pointed out to the Chinese is that you don't want Russia to lose, but do you want it to win? Can you afford that? And I think we can. I think that Trump has made clear, or has tried to make clear, that he doesn't want to see Putin fall. He doesn't want to see Russia break up. He just wants to see the war come to an end. But that, I think, is Putin thinks that he can get more.
All of this, as that war grinds on, Iranian-designed Shahed drones have been causing so much damage across Ukraine. Another of your specialisms is Russia's relations with the Middle East and Iran. Were you surprised that Moscow didn't give Iran support during those Israeli and US attacks on the country?
No, I was not in the least surprised. I think this is typical Russian behavior. No matter how much someone does for Russia, Russia does not do much in return. And I think that the Russians think that, the Iranians don't like it. What are they going to do about it? They're going to run to the Americans. Who are they going to turn to for support that will actually give it to them? And so I think that, I think from the Russian point of view is that they don't want to see the Iranian regime collapse, that's for sure. But to tell you the truth, they don't really want to see Iran acquire nuclear weapons. And if the Americans and Israelis want to do the dirty work in either preventing or at least delaying Iran from doing so, well, Russia benefits. It hasn't really lost. And I think, as far as will the Iranians retaliate by reducing their support for Russia? I think Russia now basically makes all its Iranian-designed drones itself. Maybe, I think, even with improvement. There was one Russian commentator who basically disparaged Iranian drones and how, talked about how Russia, really improved them. They're just so grateful, these people. So, and I think it's part of Putin's sort of equal opportunity foreign policy, equal opportunity contempt for adversaries and allies alike.
Does this all put pay to the idea of an axis of upheaval? We do have North Korean troops in Ukraine, or at least on Ukraine's border, but does this end this idea that this is this threatening axis that we should all be worried about?
Well, it's obviously not nothing. And clearly, Iran, China are helping Russia despite any misgivings that they have. In other words, that they're all united, that America, the West, is the greater threat. But I think that they have no illusions as to if in fact the West was seriously weakened, that Russia would not exactly be their friend and ally at that point, that there would be trouble. But, I think that, so long as the Iranians and the Chinese leaderships have such a hostile view of the West, they will put up with an awful lot from Russia. And Putin, I think, understands this. And as far as the North Koreans are concerned, this is really amazing, that the North Korea has sent, thousands of troops to fight in Ukraine. This is, and supposedly they now have a, mutual defense pact. And I guess it's, the North Korean troops are fighting on Russian territory, pushing Ukrainians out of Kursk, where the Ukrainians intervene. But, if they think that the Russians would come to their defense, I just think that they have another thing coming. And especially, so long as, Russia's consumed by its war in Ukraine, they're not coming to anybody else's defense. As we saw with regard to Assad in Syria.
Completely. Does this end Putin's determination that Russia is going to stay a great power?
I think that this is the idea that has consumed him for his entire career, that Russia is a great power, and that it is, or if it's not seen as such, it can be seen as such. That the Soviet Union did not have to collapse. That he may blame the West, but ultimately, it was decisions made by Gorbachev and Yeltsin that they didn't have to make that led to its breakup. That if it was decisions by individual leaders that could brought about the decline of the Soviet Union, individual leaders like Putin can rebuild it, and I think that's what he basically he's determined to do. And I think one of the things is that exactly what does he think? In other words, I think from the Chinese point of view, maybe if Russia and the West are sort of at each other's throats, well then China is the one that's sort of on the side and can benefit from that. And presumably a guy like Putin should understand that. He may have the idea that if and when China becomes a threat to Russia, he can turn to the West, and despite everything that's happened, the West will support Russia because it will be in the West's interest to do so, as Putin understands them. I personally am not so sure that this would be the case. I think that we'd be very willing to let Russia and China have at each other, but that I don't think. I think the Chinese have been very careful with Putin in terms of feeding his ego, telling him exactly what he wants to hear, and letting him do the dirty work essentially on China's behalf.
Finally, do you think we'll still be talking about the road to a ceasefire in 10 days' time, or in 50 days' time, or much, much longer?
I think we'll still be talking about it in 10 months' time, maybe even 10 years' time. I hope not. But I think that this conflict is likely to continue on, certainly until next year. I don't see it coming to an end. I just don't see Putin finding the necessity. If something else would have to happen, what we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union was that Moscow experienced a number of crises simultaneously, not just one country in Eastern Europe, but the entire region. What we saw was the nationalities, non-Russian nationalities, rise up. We saw all kinds of problems in what we used to call the third world, that they had not just one Vietnam, but like 6 going on simultaneously. And so I think it would have to be something that, something like this. In other words, somehow, chaos in the North Caucasus, Muslim uprisings, say after the death of Kadyrov in Chechnya, or something like this, or does the army collapse? In other words, the Russian army's taking incredible casualties. At some point, people are going to come to the conclusion, if I'm going to die anyway, let's take out these officers. Let's go for them. And the Tsarist army did collapse. I think that there there is a possibility, and I would think that for some Russian generals, there is for the sake of not just Russia but for the Russian army itself, it's going to occur to them that they'd be much better off without this guy. That they don't need this guy, and he's actually his actions are harmful. But it's easy for me to say.
Multiple black swan events all happening at the same time.
Yeah.
Professor Mark Katz, I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, great. Well, thank you so very much.